Wherever you are on life's journey, I'm sure, like me, you can look back and see certain pivotal moments that defined the rest of your life and took you to the point where you are just now, one way or another. Probably one of my most profound ones was in my late teens. I left high school without any real qualifications. I think I had a 7 and 1 or 2 standard grades. I did really badly. And I was one of those that my report card said, just one after another, plenty ability, will not apply himself, plenty ability, will not apply himself. So that was my story in high school. And then I was working, I think, as a waiter, and I got to the point one day where I could kind of see the future without any qualifications and just messing around with my friends. And I decided, I want to go back to school. I'm going to go back and redo 6th year. Because I thought, the teachers did say that I was able to do it. So I thought I'd better go and test that out and see if that was actually true, get some hires and try and sort myself out. And because I decided to do that, I know for a fact my life's different. My being able to do that led me to get a degree. Then I met my wife, now wife, shortly after that, and that led to eventually being in ministry, and so on. Here I stand before you. But if I hadn't decided to do that, none of that would have happened. But whenever you get those moments, whether it's a thought or an idea that comes to you, or a chance encounter with a person, you always have a decision and a question to make, or if you're going to take the new path that you're being offered. And in this one, we're thinking about how Jesus goes about his mission, and the invalid or disabled man has a chance encounter, as far as he's concerned, with Jesus, and he's left with a pretty big decision. Is he going to, if you like, take advantage of it? Is he going to take what he is being offered? And he gets offered a couple of things, which we're going to see, and how is the rest of his life going to shake out as a result? Now, this is a pool that we didn't know much about until probably we excavated it, and it was in the last century that happened. In some translations, you might have different translations. It'll be the pool of Bethesda or Bethsaida. It was an infamous local place known for healing. The size of it was probably about a football field, and it was kind of 2 pools split by a portico in the middle, and then there were porticos or shelters round every side. The point of it being that if folks were lying around hoping for their healing, they would need some shelter from the beating sun in the Middle East all day. And there were so many stories in the ancient world about certain waters being good for healing. The thought with this pool was that, see, it wasn't exclusive to Judaism. There's some translations you might get a footnote that says that an angel would come down and stir the waters, and that's when there would be a mad rush to try and get in. But there was also a kind of pagan background to it. So the ancient Greeks and Romans thought that one of their gods would sometimes come and stir the waters, and that would lead to healing. Basically, when there was no wind and the waters were moving, people thought something is happening there and I can get my healing. We probably reckon it was a geological event. There were kind of deep subterranean waters. I mean, and the pool itself is about 6 meters deep. So it's shrouded in mystery, but nevertheless, it was a common belief that the people in Jesus' world had, that this was a place that you would encounter healing. And a theme that we come up against all the time is that Jesus comes right into the mix of exactly the culture and the mix of beliefs that people have at the time. So he deliberately and instinctively chooses the places that are, if you like, a melting pot of what people see as their felt needs and also as their beliefs and perhaps even superstitions. And he comes and he works within that. So what I want to do to kind of break down this story is I want to look at 3 things that are said in this back and forth conversation with Jesus. I want to look at the question that Jesus asks the man, because I find it surprising, and I always do when I read it, so I want to meditate a bit on when Jesus asks, do you want to be made well? And then I want to look at a question that he is asked about Jesus. He said the religious leaders ask him, who is this man or fellow that's done this? And then lastly, I want to look at the equally, I think, puzzling statement of sin no more, that something worse may not happen to you. So we'll look at, do you want to be made well? Who did this to you? and sin no more. Verse 6, when Jesus saw him lying there, now the language there, when Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, learned and knew seem to be similar cognate words. So it could easily be translated when Jesus knew that he'd been there for a long time. So we're again and again through John being introduced to Jesus having knowledge that he couldn't possibly have otherwise had about the people that he encounters and that he sees. He connects with people because he does have the ability to be the Son of God and to know exactly what their situation and also their pain points are. So when Jesus learned and knew that he'd been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me get into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Now notice he doesn't answer the question Jesus asked him. Jesus asked him, basically, if you could be made well, is that something you would be interested in? And his mind immediately goes to the focus of, here are the barriers and the problems that I face on a regular basis. Or here is how things are set up so that I can't get well. You see, he's been in this condition 38 years, and we don't know whether he was born like this and he's 38, or whether he's in his 60s and something happened. No idea. Regardless, 38 years is a good amount of time to cement a certain way of being, of thinking, and indeed even having an identity. So the way his thoughts work and connect to one another are all based on his condition. Do you want to be made well? First thing I'm going to think is, what are the barriers to me being made well? Being well is not something that I know anything about or naturally where my mind goes, so I'm going to talk about something else other than being well. So many things we could say about that. Perhaps it's a defensive thing. I mean, perhaps he's wanting to protect himself from having hope. Maybe he's been to snake oil salesmen before and they've promised him to be well and I've got no idea. But he's not thinking in that way at all. And I think almost certainly a huge part of his identity will be in not being well. I mean, think about it. If you, quite often, if we are ill or in any way, it does become part of who we are. It can be hard for it not to become part of who we are. Perhaps, I think the fact that Jesus even asks the question means that we're meant to infer it's not obvious that he does want to be well. Now, you and I would think, oh my goodness, if I wasn't able, if I was an invalid, I had limited mobility, or maybe you do have that to a degree, or you have had in the past, you would think, well, I would do anything to have the ability. My old Shen in Lewis used to say to me, I wish I could get a shot of your legs for a few days. And I used to love the way he said that. And in my little brain, I used to think how that would work. Of course you would want, but maybe not. Many of you know Isaac, my youngest twin two, as we call him. We figured out in the last few years had pretty bad asthma because he was getting asthma attacks that would rage up out of nowhere. And then 2 or 3 times we had to call an ambulance because we'd phone NHS 24 and they'd say, he's so wee, his breathing sounds terrible, you just need to get him to the hospital. And if any of you know Isaac is quite a gregarious little fellow. He's got a big personality, he's got a big smile, and it wouldn't be long before he was charming the doctors and the nurses at the hospital because it's a 12-hour stay, and he would pass the time by engaging with them and making them his new best pals. And we then got to the point where if Isaac would start to have a bit of a wheeze, even though his asthma was under control with good inhalers, he would look at us and say, think I need to go to A&E. And we're thinking, it's always 12 hours because they need to check his stats are good for 3 solid hours before they let him out, and you lose a whole day, and it's the last thing we want. And he became quite attached to it because it was a good day out for him, and he made lots of new pals. So it's a silly illustration of the fact that we can start to identify and even like the things around being ill. Perhaps, it's for this guy, it might be being an invalid, but it might be any number of illnesses, might be even a certain mental health condition. It's possible for those things to become so part of us that it's not obvious that if someone were to take them away, that we would even recognize ourselves anymore, even though it would be objectively better, because it's a huge change. It's starting everything from scratch, and that's sometimes something we don't take enough account of. Now, what's the point of this in terms of how Jesus approaches mission? Jesus is not only gentle, but he respects the agency that you and I have as creatures and people who have been made in God's image. He knows that we have been made with our own will and mind and decisions, and he is not going to bulldoze through that. He comes to a man who has not asked to meet Jesus. This guy isn't particularly seeking, and we see that quite a bit. He doesn't really seem to have very much faith either, because sometimes we think, getting a healing or whatever is contingent on having enough faith, and that's not the case here. He does heal him, and the man doesn't have any faith. So he comes to someone, but he will not override what he wants for himself. He'll ask him, do you want to be made well? And sometimes, I've seen someone write an article about it, people who are perhaps, they're disabled, but they also have faith in Christianity. And if they go to a certain lively or charismatic type church or event or movement, then they're basically treated as a test case, as somebody who's there to be able to prove that Christianity works or that Jesus does healings, and just completely bypasses and overrides their dignity and their individuality as somebody made in the image of God, as if, they're just going around waiting for a healing and a miracle. And so Jesus doesn't do that. He says, do you want to be made well? He engages with him on those terms. He is not only sensitive, but he is personable in the way he comes to people. And that's the way Jesus comes to you and me, and the way he will come to anyone. He won't smash through them. He won't force them. He won't coerce them. And so many expressions of church really need to learn this, that in this age and the era that we're in and the way the kingdom of God comes, it doesn't come at the end of a sword or with an iron fist. It doesn't even come with any heavy-handed tactics or trying to convince people that, you really need to be saved, or manipulation tactics. It comes with a question. Do you want to be made well? And he asks us the same thing and offers us through the gospel and through invitation to come to him and to find the healing he's able to give to our souls, our wants, our needs, our desires. The fact that we do feel like broken icons and human beings. He comes and he asks, do you want this to be different? Do you want this to be made well? Because it can through relationship and connection to him. But he'll always ask, and he always allows us to answer. And then the man's dramatically healed, and he must have changed or felt something, because he picks up his mat and he walks when Jesus says it to him. And then we find out that it was the Sabbath, and so he plods on, and Jesus directly instructed him, take up your mat and walk, and he heads off. And then the Jewish leader said to the man, it's a Sabbath, the law forbids you to carry your mat. Now, there was about 40-odd classifications of work that the Jewish leaders had come up with. And doing any of those things constituted work. And one of them was carrying something from one place to another, because it was the idea that, it requires some kind of labor and exertion to do that, so you shouldn't be doing that. So anyway, the kind of religious police come and get him. And they say, you can't be carrying your mat, it's the Sabbath. And then he replied, the man who made me well said to me, pick up your mat and walk. So he offloads it onto Jesus. He doesn't want to get in trouble with these guys. And he says, I'm not doing this on my own agency. And it's kind of, I think John records these things because we're meant to see them as kind of absurd. Almost certainly, everyone would have known this is one of the invalids who hangs around at the pool. And the conversation isn't, oh my word, you've been made well. How come you're walking? It's, why are you carrying a mat on the Sabbath? And there is an absurdity to it, and I think this isn't really one of my points, but as an aside, the more wrapped up that we get in religious nitpicking or obsession with tradition or whatever it is, the more likely our religion is to become absurd and disconnected from humanity and from the compassion that would normally entail within us. Anyway, so they asked him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walked?" And at this point, the man didn't know it was Jesus, because Jesus didn't really identify himself, and he had slipped away into the crowd. Now, this is amazing, because the man was healed by Jesus simply speaking the words. He didn't do a kind of magic trick or spell, or he just spoke the words. And it's a theme that starts right in the beginning of Genesis, because the world is created by God speaking with creative force and power, and things simply come and appear. And there's a sort of understatedness to the fact that God is able to do that. And Jesus later on in this passage says, "I'm doing my Father's work." You see, he's revealing his identity to anyone who's got their ears and eyes open, because only God was allowed to do any work on the Sabbath in the kind of Jewish religious conception, and only God could speak things into existence. And so he speaks this man's ability to walk into existence, and he commands him to do what only God can do. And he's leaving these signposts for everyone to see, and even to have faith and believe in that God's Messiah is here. But they don't. It just makes them more angry, and it kind of rage baits them in a way. And this is what I found interesting reading it this week. It was actually my wife that asked me this question about the text. She said, why did Jesus slip away without anybody knowing who he was or wanting to tell people who he was? Because it's counterintuitive to human behavior. So often people who have any kind of amazing ability, they get a really good PR package, so that, you know, it takes them as far as they can get in terms of recognition and fame. And it's the ecosystem that we live in. And they had their famous healers and celebrity healers in the ancient world, and we still have people who are famous for all kinds of things today. And it's a pernicious human desire to want to get up on a platform, to have all people looking at you, and to be celebrating how great you are. And Jesus does the absolute opposite of that. He didn't even tell that guy who he was. Now, I think the theological reason is that it does two things. It shows his humility, because he has humility that is supernatural, that is uncharacteristically unhuman. But also, he's not wanting to be crowned and exalted the way we tend to do with human beings, because we take part in that as well. We put people up on the pedestal. He knows that that's the proclivity of the human heart, and he has not come as a political revolutionary, because that's what people are thinking about their Messiah at this time. That guy, if we can get him enough prominence, he'll clear out all our enemies and the Romans, and it's just not the kind of kingdom that he's come to bring. So he resists that, and he slips away. There's a movie in the cinema just now, and there's loads of PR problems around it, because one of the actresses, Blake Lively, is seen to be doing the opposite of Jesus. The movie is about domestic violence, and it's got some serious issues behind it, but unfortunately, and perhaps through poor advice, she's using it to make the movie seem lighter than it is, but also to sell her personal products of hair care and drinks products. And it's seen, and it leaves a bad taste in most people's mouths, because they can see that this is a really serious topic. It should have some levity and should have some gravity around it. And this is just a real misfire. But it's very difficult for a lot of people to not seize any opportunity to be elevated up above the crowd, and to have people gaze at them, and to have people buy into how fantastic they are. And some people actually need that in order to, that's how they kind of survive and what they subsist on. And Jesus doesn't do that. And he's not that kind of savior. And here's why I think it's good news. If you're someone who doesn't particularly like that and likes to retire and recede a wee bit, and don't particularly want to be famous, then it's not something that's wrong with you. It's something that's actually wrong with our culture and our humanity. It doesn't help anyone that we do that, particularly when it's, beyond all reason. But also, it means that we're safe with Jesus, because so many charismatic and cult-type leaders, all they're doing is building a following to elevate themselves and to use the people underneath them. And Jesus never did that and will never do that, because it's against his nature. Anytime he has an opportunity to benefit or gain for himself, he shuns it and he slips away. The only time that he's willing to be elevated and seen by everyone and have the gaze on him is when he's really hanging on a cross, and he does that for you and for me, and that's the heart of the gospel. It can be hard to know where to put our trust and our faith, and particularly today in the marketplace of spirituality and ideas and the different things on offer to us. And I would like to take your gaze to the one who, when he is lifted up, it's in agony, and it's dying for your and my sins. Such is his love for us, and such is his only desire to be lifted up and exalted, is that he might give himself for others. Who is the fellow who told you to pick it up and walk? It was the Son of God, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. And lastly, later Jesus found him at the temple, which this is religious festival time. Almost certainly that should have been a bit of a struggle, but Jesus knows this man and he's invested in his journey. See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you. And the man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. I think there's so much in that verse, but I also thought that it jumps out as being quite strange, that if I didn't take it on and explain it, then you might feel a bit shortchanged, because it's probably what I puzzled over mostly this week, of stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. It seems a bit harsh for Jesus, doesn't it? Now, I think the easiest leap to make here, and I want to deal with this because it's a pastoral issue, is that you could logically go, Jesus was saying, you got into the condition of being an invalid because of your sin, so now stop that sin so that God won't make you an invalid again. And then people draw a connection between your sin and getting incapacitated or sick, sin and sickness, drawing a line. It's a simple thing to do, but it's a very wrong thing to do. Because later in John 9, you know the story with the man who's blind and Jesus heals him, and they ask him, was it this man's sin or his parents' sin that caused him to be blind? And Jesus says, neither. It's so that the glory and the power of God might be demonstrated. I cannot stress this enough, that whatever conclusion we take from this, it is so faulty and it is so dangerous for us to assume that anybody's sickness or incapacitation is due to their personal sin. Let me prove it to you. I know loads of saints, good people, godly, holy people who absolutely represent the character and the love of Jesus to me. And they're either disabled or sick or chronically unwell or have had bouts of really serious affliction and illness. Okay? I also know some absolute heathens, and they seem to have no health problems at all. Some really wicked people, either know or know of, right? So it can't be that, because that doesn't work wherever you apply it. I hope that's liberating to you if you've ever had that put on you and has caused some guilt. And I hope it kind of instructs us if we've ever been wondering about that. What we have to give up here is our omniscience and say, Jesus has already proved he knows this man's whole story. He's known that he's been an invalid for 38 years. Jesus knows all that as the Son of God. It's almost certain that Jesus knows something that we don't about this man and in this story. Maybe Jesus knows what his life looks like. Maybe he knows he's got some sort of sin in his heart, and it actually leads to him being in some dangerous or risky situations. That's an obvious thing enough to draw. Some things that we do that we know are wrong can get us into trouble and get us into situations we'd rather not be in. Or maybe he knows something about the man's condition, that despite the fact that he's been healed, that it's a gift, but he's not now going to choose for anything to be different as a result. Let me explain to you what I mean. Healing, if you can't walk and you're healed and you're able to walk, that would be one thing. But you still need to learn to live a new life, to identify with that, and to give credit and praise to Jesus for it. Maybe the man was so consumed with self-pity, and self-pity is just a kind of inverse form of pride, kind of the continual woe is me thing. Maybe that was so eating him up. Maybe Jesus was saying, you need to take this as a clean break and don't go and find the next thing to make everyone feel really sorry for you and go around with that. Like, actually enjoy and walk in your miracle. Because you have a body and you have a soul. And I think it's all one. And it's not always easy for us to separate them. So maybe his mindset and his soul hadn't really changed much. And Jesus is saying, he's given him the sharp shock, the warning to go, let this be the first new day of the rest of your life. Whatever that looked like. And I think if we leave it that general and broad, we can all take that. Because when Jesus comes to us and asks us, do you want what I have? That sense of life and purpose and belonging and the love of God washing over you. Do you want that now and for the rest of your life? Because he's not going to force it on you. And do you want to make sure that whatever your future looks like, that God is in it? Because that's a choice, and I think that's a choice that he's giving the man here. And then in verse 15, the man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. And so I think, in some sense, that's the verse where the healing really occurs. Because Jesus lets him know that just because he'd experienced being able to walk, maybe not everything had been changed. And I think in verse 14 and 15, everything changes. And so I don't think Jesus is saying to him, if you don't act a certain way, God's going to come down on you like a hammer. I think he's saying to him, you still have a choice. You had a choice whether you wanted to encounter my grace and to be made well. There was then the question where we considered the fact that it was really the Son of God that had done that. And then he gives them the choice of what's the rest of your life going to look like. And Jesus does the same to us. He comes to us and he asks us, will we accept the gospel despite the fact that we might not feel like we deserve it? He then demonstrates to us that he is the Son of God and he has the ability to save us and deliver us and to heal our hearts. And then he leaves us with the choice. So over to you now. What do you do with that great gift? May God bless this word to us this morning. Amen.